Hi, I'm Maddie May, and today I will be discussing Fashionable Politics, a visual analysis of the clothes that won the 2020 election. So, to begin, here is an outline of what we will be discussing today. We have an introduction in which I will discuss the 2020 election and fashion as rhetoric, a rhetorical framework, as well as my thesis. And then we will approach three themes: normal appeal, avoidance of discourse, and unity and separation. And then we will conclude talking about the effectiveness on the audience and the so what of this research. So, for context, I'm sure most of you know that the 2020 election was intensely polarized in the midst of a pandemic and an economic recession. Biden and Harris versus incumbent Trump and Pence ended up coming relatively close in terms of election votes. Um, For my framework, I wanted to discuss Daniel Miller's Why Clothing is Not Superficial from 2010, in which he discusses The Emperor's New Clothes, which is a story about an emperor who's tricked into thinking that his tailors have made him a cloth so fine that it's invisible to people who are unworthy to see it. As a result, he goes around naked. Um, so Miller implies that clothes receive rhetorical value from the wearer. In his study, Daniel Miller included case studies from three different cultures, and from that, he derived that clothing represents situational identity. He argues that clothing represents momentary versions of the authentic self. So, when talking about politics, one might consider the idea that everything in politics is fabricated in some way or another. But is it not still a politician's choice to dress as they do? If anything, I think this further strengthens the argument for the rhetorical value of fashion. As a note, I had originally intended on speaking about media criticism of women's fashion and politics, but one thing I noticed was that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have had virtually no controversy surrounding their clothing choices, whereas Melania Trump has had plenty. This is very likely due to the fact that Trump has been more recently visible for the past 4 years, though Dr. Biden did operate as Second Lady for 8 years prior. I found this interesting, and as a result, I decided that the most recent election was going to be the direction in which I would narrow my research. So, as a thesis, the Biden Harris campaign used fashion as a means to strengthen their brand, ultimately resulting in a win in the 2020 election. And this is made evident through their clothing choices in relating to everyday Americans, avoiding any clothing based discourse if possible, and both promoting unity across the political spectrum and separating themselves from the Trump administration. In this presentation, the focus will be on the clothes rather than on the photographs. And this is because the fashion itself is the visual artifact up for analysis. So this is the first theme, the normal appeal, and here are just a couple of examples of the ways that the Bidens and Kamala Harris's family dress to appear normal. So the Biden-Harris campaign used clothing choices in terms of approachability and relatability. To begin, according to standard, Dr. Jill Biden's choice to dress in semi casual clothing is a practical choice, as she plans to keep her job as a professor when she becomes First Lady. Dr. Biden's reflection of her job in her education career within her fashion helps to solidify her and her husband's identities as average Americans and allows a large number of working women to relate to her. To further the Bidens and the Harrises' relatability factor, they dress as is typical of any upper middle class American family. And as a result, their position appears to be a lot more attainable to the average American. In addition, Harris chooses to mix both casual clothing and pearls in her outfits, which, according to Harper's Bazaar, also contributes to her relatability. The second theme I would like to discuss is the Biden's and Harris's avoidance of any clothing based discourse. So, another way that the Biden Harris campaign uses clothing to define their brand is their lack of exceptional styling and unique clothing. Not much particularly stood out about either family in terms of their clothing choices, and as a result, their unremarkable clothing allowed them to slip under the radar in terms of fashion controversy, according to Standard and the Post Gazette. In addition, Teen Vogue notes that a politician's use of color in a campaign can represent solidarity with a specific group, And the Bidens and Harrises have been known to wear blue often in uh, assumed solidarity with the Democratic Party, and also blue does tend to be a common suit color, so that could be solidarity with the average American. Very Well Mind also suggests that the color blue can be used to calm and inspire others, which also could have been a political strategy in order to appear friendly and non threatening. Our third theme here is unity and separation. So, this is mostly characterized by the differences between the clothing choices of the Biden Harris campaign and the Trump family. So while Melania Trump has had her fair share of clothing controversies, which are most notably her "I don't really care, do you" jacket that she wore while visiting separated Mexican families at the border, as well as her Louboutin stilettos that she wore to a Hurricane Harvey disaster site, as described by Harper's Bazaar. The main focus that I would like to place currently is on the opulence of the Trump family's clothing. Whereas the Biden Harris campaign all dress similarly in nice but off the rack suits and dresses, their clothing is not traced as often to as overwhelmingly expensive designer brands as is the Trump family's, according to Vanity Fair. If Miller's correct in saying that clothing is a reflection of the authentic self, then it does an excellent job in defining the Trumps as distinctly wealthy, and the Bidens and Harrises as average middle class Americans. Um, the contrast also aids in the idea that a new presidency will lead to the return to normalcy, which is something that America has obviously been craving since March. In addition, the relatability of the Bidens and the Harrises clothing helps to blur ideological lines, which, as a majority of Americans are unable to afford the clothes that the Trump family wears, the Bidens and the Harrises clothes are more attainable. In conclusion, according to Miller, the clothing we wear is a mirror of our situationally authentic selves. Whether this is fabricated or not, the public will perceive this to be the case. As a result, I believe that the politicians on both sides of the election effectively communicated who they wanted the public to believe they were and what they believed in through their choice in clothing. I have no doubt that the Biden Harris campaign's choice to stay under the radar, both with their appearances in media and with their fashion, contribute significantly to their 2020 election win. Thank you. And here are my references. All right. Thank you once again.